Who are the interpreter?
Yeah, we have two interpreters on this meeting, so.
Two interpreters on this. Okay. You're one and. Thank you.
They turn their video off so they don't show up on your screen.
Okay,
But they'll switch out.
great. So we can begin. Okay. Thank you. Welcome to everyone, our interpreters, as well as anyone watching. We have Senator Hashim has S-172, an act relating to the Education Bill of Rights of Children who are deaf, hard of hearing, or deaf and blind. So we're going to have Senator Hashim talk a little bit about the bill, and we'll have Legislative Counsel take us through the bill.
Thank you. So I'll just provide some context and a high-level overview, and I'll leave the full walkthrough to Leg Counsel. But just for some context, the Austin School for the Deaf was a facility that was in Windham County, which closed in 2014, and this bill originated from a number of constituents who requested it, and I agreed to try to guide this through. And I'll say that the overall goal of this is to reduce discrimination and mistreatment, reduce isolation, and also make sure that we're providing equitable education opportunities for folks who are deaf, hard of hearing, or deafblind. And I'll also add that creating a deaf Bill of Rights is not a unique or out of this world idea. There are 18 other states who currently have a similar Bill of Rights. I got the main substance of this from Maine, no pun intended, and that was that there were some changes here. I did add at the recommendation of constituents. I also added a distinction for, this isn't just a deaf Bill of Rights. This is also for folks who are hard of hearing or deafblind, and folks in all three of these communities have different needs and different abilities. So that is really the general overview, and I will leave. Oh, and actually, I'll also point out it wasn't planned, but it's a good coincidence that the Human Rights Commission was testifying right before us. And if you look at the data that they provided on page 11 of their report, in 2023, cases related to disability were the highest number of cases that they received. So, and it's also one of the recommendations that we were just talking about. So things to take into consideration as we discuss this.
And Senator Hashim, you said that a number of states have already passed this.
Yes. 18.
Any other questions for Senator Hashim? Okay, Ms. St. James.
Thank you, Beth St. James, Office of Legislative Counsel. This is a walkthrough of S-172, an act relating to the Education Bill of Rights for children who are deaf, hard of hearing, or deafblind. This is the bill proposes to add new language to Title 16 in Chapter 101, the Special Education chapter. Should you choose to take up this bill, we can certainly talk about if that's the right place for it. But it proposes to add a new section, 2946, entitled the Education Bill of Rights for children who are deaf, hard of hearing, or deafblind. And so the first subsection establishes certain rights. So children who are deaf, hard of hearing, or deafblind shall have an education in which their language and communication modes, as well as their existing listening and speaking ability, as their hearing level and technology allows, are respected, used, and developed to an appropriate level of proficiency. And they shall be ensured the following rights in public schools and approved independent schools. We're on page 2 now. A high quality, ongoing, and fluent means of communication, both inside and outside of the classroom. Placement in the least restrictive educational environment, and services and accommodations provided based on the child's unique communication, language, and educational needs, consistent with the IDEA, Section 504, and the Americans with Disabilities Act. Subdivision 3, an education in which teachers, related service providers, and assessors understand the unique nature of deafness, are specially trained to work with children who are deaf, hard of hearing, or deafblind, and can communicate spontaneously and fluently with these children. An education in which children who are deaf, hard of hearing, or deafblind are exposed to role models who are also deaf, hard of hearing, or deafblind. Direct and appropriate access to all components of the educational process, including recess, lunch, and extracurricular social and athletic activities, consistent with IDEA, Section 504, and the Americans with Disabilities Act. And on page 3 now, subdivision 6, line 3, educational programs, and we're still talking about all of the rights afforded. Educational programs with transitional planning as required under the IDEA that focus on the unique vocational needs of children who are deaf, hard of hearing, or deafblind. The opportunity to choose a variety of languages, communication modes, and technologies to enhance language learning. Teachers, consultants, and interpreters proficient in appropriate language and communication modes and credentialed in their professional field. The opportunity to develop proficiency in American Sign Language and English, including spoken and written forms, and manual visual methods of communication. And finally, balanced and complete information for each family of a child who is deaf, hard of hearing, or deafblind regarding their child's educational and communication needs, available programmatic placement and resource options, support services and advocacy resources from private and public agencies and institutions, and available resources pertaining to hearing loss and the needs of children who are deaf, hard of hearing, or deafblind. I'm on page 4, subsection B is entitled Eligibility for Early Intervention Services. So this subsection is specific to kiddos that are preschool age. So any infant with a documented hearing loss prior to demonstration of any developmental delay shall categorically qualify for services as determined by that infant's individualized family service plan team. Subsection C, parents and legal guardians of children who are deaf, hard of hearing, or deafblind, and their advocates shall be given an opportunity to be involved in determining the extent, content, and purpose of educational programs for their children. Subsection D requires the State Board of Education to develop rules to implement this section. And at a minimum, so you're giving the State Board of Education some legislative direction, some legislative intent here. At a minimum, the rules have to include the qualifications of personnel providing professional services to children who are deaf, hard of hearing, or deafblind within the school system, the composition of the individualized family service plan team and the individualized education program team, the individualized communication plan, including language acquisition and ongoing language development evaluation for every student who is deaf, hard of hearing, or deafblind, procedures and materials for assessment and placement, psychological counseling and mental health services, evaluation of the effectiveness of programs for students who are deaf, hard of hearing, or deafblind, and the creation of a complaint and resolution process to ensure compliance with this section. And the bill proposes to take effect on July 1, 2024.
Questions for Ms. Higgins, please, Senator.
So, do we know how many people, how many students in Vermont are fit into those categories?
I don't have the number off the top of my head.
Okay, so do we, what do they do now for, to make sure, is there a special school? Because it sounds like to me what we're doing is we're gonna require every school to have the curriculum and the instructors to be able, the teachers to be able to do this. Is that accurate?
What is your question? I'm not
Are
sure.
we requiring every school to have teachers that meet these qualifications? Train these,
If there's a student there with that need,
Okay,
and yeah, they would.
Yeah, please.
So in industry, we call the concept BLUF, BLUF. Bottom line up front. What's the bottom line? What's not happening now? Versus what we're trying to establish. And going back to Terry's question.
I think that is a question that is best answered by the constituents who I spoke with, who explained a number of stories that I don't want to share for them because they're not my experiences to share, but a number of stories that describe the discrimination, the isolation, and the lack of resources for their kids who do fall into one of these categories. So that's really,
So is the intent to Terry's point, Senator Williams' point, is the intent to create in the local school level, if there's a student in the community that fits this criteria, that the local school provide these resources? Is that? Well, the words in my mouth, I'm
Yep,
trying to
that's-
understand what we're doing.
I think that's the correct interpretation of it.
Ms. St. James, do you
Education
wanna?
is a constitutional right. It's the only government service that is considered a right, and it has to be equitable to all students, regardless of ability.
In testimony, it would be helpful to understand what's the current scenario versus what's the desired scenario.
Yeah, no, I agree. I did accidentally leave out at the beginning that it's going to be essential that we hear from folks who fall into these different categories so that we hear about what is happening or what isn't happening when it comes to education and learning.
so in the past, I mean, if I had a child who was deaf, hard of hearing or deaf blind, and I wanted to move to Vermont, I would look for a school that, where my child could get educated. So this is gonna be more of a convenience for the family, for sure. If they can move to a town that has a school system and then require them to have somebody that's qualified to train them. I'm trying to figure out how we're gonna work this.
Or maybe if the child's born in the town,
Right,
that's the other thing, you know.
right. Yeah, I get it, I'm with you.
Yeah.
But we don't wanna be requiring schools, to come up with resources that, number one, right now, they can't afford. Number two, that, I'm sure the school system and probably the municipality would want to provide for that student. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think it'll also be essential to hear from all the V's, the NEA, and teachers as to how we make this a feasible thing to implement.
Thank you.
Yeah, please.
So please, that piece.
No, I was just gonna say, I've asked the V's to come in next week, but it would be great if you could give us a constituent or two for next week also. Just to, maybe before they come in, just say this is the need, that this is filling, yeah, please.
And also keep in mind that this is really a starting point, and it does generally reflect, we did make some changes, but, it does generally reflect Maine's deaf Bill of Rights but obviously not everything they do, we can necessarily do here. So just again, to reiterate, this is a starting point. Happy to move and mix things around based on what we hear from our committee, from constituents, and the different stakeholders who will testify.
Please.
Just because it's a new term, the bill includes deaf blind. Get it? But why not blind? I mean, blind also, is blind excluded for a reason here? As opposed to this combined deaf blind compound word?
No, that was a specific request from constituents. Initially, it just said deaf, and then there was a lot of correspondence about making sure that we include hard of hearing or deaf blind. If you want to add blind to it, then, well, I mean, I think. Yeah, I think we want to hear testimony, whether or not.
Okay.
Blind should
Sure,
be
I
added.
just said, don't want to be exclusionary at the expense of expedience.
Yeah, no, I agree.
Okay, so the other day we reviewed, costs of special education programs. It's currently is the education, for students who are deafblind, are they included in that special education, roll-up?
I think that might be a question for Beth.
Okay.
Ms. St. James, do you know the answer to that question?
I'm sorry, could you say it again?
Sure, are students who are deaf, hard of hearing, or deaf blind, are they included in special education numbers that we see?
Yeah, so I can't answer that question directly, but I would highly encourage you to hear from special educators because there's a probability that many of the rights afforded in here are also required under those federal laws that we talked about, IDA Section 504 and the Americans with Disabilities Act. And there's processes for, there's already very specific processes for grievances or complaints when services are not provided under those laws. So this bill might expand upon them. It might just memorialize them. But whether or not everyone who meets the definition of deaf, deafblind, or hard of hearing qualifies for special education services is not a question I can answer. But certainly I would encourage you to hear from the special education community on that.
So does deaf blind include just blind people?
Again, I'm not sure that I am the expert to speak on this. As a lawyer and looking at the words on this bill, I would say no. This bill is very specific about hearing deficit and the services provided for hearing deficit. You'll notice it's, interpreters, American Sign Language, etc. So I would suspect that if we are looking at providing rights and services for individuals who are blind, that there would perhaps need to be more services involved here. This seems to me to be targeted towards hearing deficit.
Senator Williams, just a quick look at that definition. I wasn't familiar with the term either. It says deafblindness is a combination of vision and hearing loss. Deafblindness encompasses spectrum from mildly hard of hearing plus mildly visually impaired to totally deaf, totally blind, or a combination of the severity. You have a question?
Just one.
Please.
So on page 4, on line 5, you characterize an infant's individualized family service plan team. Do you know what that is? Is that a medical team or is that an education team?
That would be an education team. I mean, like the folks who are handling the IEP.
Okay, but it seems that this is like early intervention, which could be, 0 to 3. I mean,
No.
and they're not in school yet. Just wondering, in testimony, if they can kind of elaborate on that, so we understand who's making this identification and, kind of just what professional level we're speaking.
Yeah.
Good bill.
Yeah.
Anything else? Morgan, anything for you? No. All right, be on your toes. Thank you all very much. Appreciate our interpreters, taking the time to be with us. Thank you both. And Ms. St. James, thank you. And we'll look forward to seeing everyone next week. Oh, Ms. St. James, do you mind sticking around for a minute?